Okay, so I'm not actually going to be talking about Matilda, but I'm going to be talking about punishment and sort of the, next slide, the positive and sort of negative aspects of punishment. And the positive aspects because it has been used in schools, still is used in schools sort of throughout the world, and there's got to be a reason why it's being used. So I'm just going to talk briefly about classroom discipline and classroom misbehaviour, and then I'll talk about the negative aspects and why it should be used with care. So, start off with the positive aspects. Classroom discipline. Lewis said that one of the most significant roles of the teacher is maintaining classroom discipline. I mean, obviously it's really important that they teach and the children learn, but they need to do it in an environment that is conducive to learning, and you can't do that if children are sort of being really disruptive, because disruptive behaviour affects the whole class. It's not, you might have one child being disruptive, but I'll talk about it later, but it sort of spreads and disrupts the whole class, not just that one child that's being disruptive. And punishment, in that case, punishment allows teachers to immediately sort of abate the problem and get rid of the problem sort of before it becomes an issue for the rest of the class. So then Lewis later on, he said that punishment is used as a response to misbehaviour, whereas reinforcement is used to decrease its likelihood over time. So that's sort of the difference between using reinforcement and punishment. It's that using reinforcement, you sort of gradually over time sort of get rid of the inappropriate behaviours by by using reinforcement, whereas punishment is a response to when a child does misbehave. And yeah, they point out that reinforcement is much more effective at shaping behaviour than punishment, but sometimes inappropriate behaviour needs to be dealt with quickly and effectively, and reinforcement just doesn't allow for this. And then, so Becker said that when you use reinforcement, you ignore inappropriate behaviour and reinforce the appropriate behaviour, but sometimes you can't, if behaviour that you want to ignore is becoming destructive and becoming a big problem, you can't ignore that and you have to do something about it. So it can sort of no longer be ignored. So yeah. And then we get on to classroom misbehaviour. So that was just sort of how punishment is used to maintain discipline in the classroom and sort of create an environment that is effective to learn in. So then we get to misbehaviour, and Moles said that punishment is mainly used to combat misbehaviour. And there's sort of people's idea of misbehaviour is perhaps different to what it actually is. Like when you say misbehaviour, lots of people think violence and stuff, and I remember like you just read the news and you hear about violence in school. Like yesterday I was reading how, was it a teacher put a gun to a kid's head, and there's also a few years ago reading about how someone in school, they like took the blade out of a sharpener and started like cutting people's faces. That's not sort of the general misbehaviour. It's sort of, Moles says that it involves more attention, crowd control and getting work done. So it's sort of the opposite of those. So it gets, the child just wants attention, wants to sort of take control and just doesn't want to do their work. So that's more like what misbehaviour is, not the extreme violence. But again, Moles points out that it affects the whole class and even goes as far as calling it contagious. And I'm sure like you can all remember being at school, and I know I can in year 10 maths. All it takes is one child to sort of shout out or be disruptive, and then that spreads to the child next to them. And then before you know it, the whole class is just not learning, making it. In my school, I didn't go to a bad school, but they kind of made fun of the teachers, and I didn't learn basically anything in year 10 because of that. And he kind of points out that if a teacher is to focus all their efforts on using reinforcement with one disruptive child, then the whole of the class is going to suffer, because like they're focusing on that, whereas everyone else's education, that's where they're not focusing on that. So reinforcement does have a place, but in sort of this cases with misbehaviour, it's sometimes better to like use punishment to just quickly stop the bad behaviour before it becomes an issue for the rest of the class, because it's not fair on their education. It's also, Moles, he points out two areas, or like highlights two questions where you need to take great care when giving out punishments, and it is who is the punishment for and what are the effects of the punishment. You kind of need to take these into account before you use it, and it's sort of pointed out that there's a difference between a child who is being disruptive because they want to be disruptive and a child that's being disruptive simply because they can't engage with the material, and it's sort of, you wouldn't use the same punishments for those two children. And in fact, I would argue for the second person who just can't engage with the material, perhaps a punishment isn't the most effective thing there. That's where you would use reinforcement to try and draw their attention back in on the work. But for a child who's being disruptive because they want to be disruptive, clearly you need to take more steps to ensure that sort of you deal with the problem effectively. So yeah, now I'll get on to the more negative aspects of punishment. And the first question I'll look at is who is typically getting punished. Guerra found that in American schools it was frequently minorities who were getting punished a lot, and it's sort of not just sort of one time, one suspension, and then they're better again. It's sort of constantly getting punished. And I think that while it's sort of interesting that it's minorities getting punished, I think it speaks quite a lot about punishment, the fact that they're continually getting punished and see no behavioural change at all, because it's happening all the time. And there was a comment on my blog that sort of, it highlighted a point that perhaps it's not being punishing, it's actually reinforcing the behaviour, but I'm going to talk about that later. So yeah, it was basically found that punishment isn't used for like just disruptive behaviour, it's sort of focused in on select groups. Now Hurrell, he interestingly didn't find any discrimination for race or socioeconomic status, but did for gender. Even when you take into account children's behaviour, it was found that boys were getting punished more than girls. And I think perhaps maybe this reflects societal norms or expectations. You kind of expect the boys to be more misbehaved and be in detention, so perhaps they're like playing to that, and sort of without realising it, they're punishing boys more. But then this highlights another big problem with punishment. It's the fact that the teachers are the ones dishing out all the punishment, and they aren't like perfect. I talk about Lewis. They're not impartial superhumans like I imagine Judge Dredd, sort of going around like, you have been judged. But it's the teachers, they hold all the biases and prejudices that you and I hold, and sort of it's really hard for them to be impartial all the time, and it's kind of, I guess it's sort of unreasonable to expect them to sort of, while they're trying to teach, they don't have a lot of time on their hands to then evaluate every single decision they make. But yeah, so this just, it highlights the fact that teachers, whilst they are sort of an authority, should they really be dishing out punishments when they hold these biases, and it's kind of hard for them to stay impartial. So yeah, and then is it effective? Mag 2001, he said that punishment was one of the reasons it's so widely used is because it's easy to implement. Reinforcement takes a lot of patience and time, sort of work with a child and sort of build it up over a long period, and teachers are kind of already really hard pressed, so it's kind of unreasonable to expect them to spend all that time trying to reinforce every child. So punishments can be used sort of like how, just as an example, it's easy to shout at a child and sit down with them for 10 minutes every lesson and sort of work with them, and teachers just don't have a lot of time. And then but it still mentions that the method of punishment, whilst it's quick to implement, the method is still very important, because Turner and Watson, they looked at timeouts, and they found that whilst they can be useful and do have their place, one problem with them is that they actually may serve to reinforce bad behaviour. Because if a child is acting out and they don't want to do the work, if you then give them a timeout, they're getting away from the work that they didn't want to do. So that this goes back to that Noguera study. Sort of, perhaps they weren't punishing the children, they were actually unintentionally reinforcing their bad behaviour. And this kind of teaches, you just think of punishments and like sort of what is the norm for punishment, detention, suspensions. They kind of use them without giving it proper thought as to what they're actually doing to the behaviour of the children, which it calls into question many of the punishments. Like, are they really punishing? Are they really serving, like, are they really helping like children's education? Because like they should be. Obviously, reinforcement is more effective, but it can't always be used. But punishment, you need to be aware of what the punishment is doing and its effects. So yeah, in conclusion, punishment does have a place when children are sort of acting out and you need to stop it immediately. That's where punishment comes in useful, but the wrong types of punishment can sort of serve the opposite effect and actually reinforce bad behaviour. So this calls into question like whether they should be used, and if they should, then you need to use like great care when using the punishments. So yes, thank you for listening. Has anyone got any questions?
Kind of questions to come. You spoke a lot about sort of the time that teachers have to put in to sort of get these things to work, and one of the things that we found sort of researching is that you don't have to sort of like, you don't have to specifically focus on that reinforcement of one child. There's a really big improvement that can happen if you just make the environment as a whole reinforcing.
Yeah.
So you can make quite a big improvement just by making your whole classroom reinforcing, rather than having to specifically focus on reinforcing the behaviour of race. So I think that's one thing that can be taken into account.
Yeah. So if you make a reinforcing environment, then it
Gets you on the first
yeah.
almost.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. But then it's sort of there might be children that still just want to misbehave.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not
And
disputing that punishment sometimes doesn't have to be. But
Yeah.
the more reinforcing things get, you don't have to work on both at the same time almost.
Yeah.
If the reinforcement increases, the punishment naturally drops.
Well, there we go then.
I was obviously at school for 20 years before you got worse. And when people played our classes, you were made to stand up at the front of the class and take the class standing up in front of them. You still have to take the class, but you've got the embarrassment of standing there, all class, even if it's an hour or 2 hours, because you didn't want to.
Yeah.
You didn't get out of it, it was just more uncomfortable for you.
Which makes it definitely
Yeah.
punishing.
Which is
the
punishing.
There's a lot.
Well, no, it's not, because I think you've got to learn punishment. When you leave school, you do something naughty, you will be punished. Kids need to be taught that naughty things do get punished.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's, oh, but it wasn't my fault. You're still going to prison. You've got to learn punishment. You've got to learn naughty action.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think, that punishments do serve a purpose in schools, and rather than get rid of them completely and use reinforcement all the time, they still do need to be there, but just perhaps used differently to how they currently are being used.
And I don't know what it was like when you were at school, but teachers never dished out punishment. It was their head that dished
Really?
out punishment.
It was my teachers that did.
Well, we got taken out if it was particularly bad. It was, if who were standing at the front then, after the class, went to the headmaster and had to tell them what we'd done. And they were the disciplinarian, so it was out of the teacher's control, so there was no bias there.
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe there should be one person that does it.
Yeah. Yeah.